afternoon. This will be a review, this overview of medications for Parkinson's disease. There's so many ways that one could discuss these things, depending on the audience. I could give you a list of all the drugs that we use for Parkinson's disease, and it wouldn't be that helpful to you. You say, oh yeah, I've been on that one. No, I wasn't on that one. No, this one made me sick. This one made me throw up, etc. So I'm not going to do that. Well, my approach that I really enjoy best is historical, how things came to be, so that we have the present regimen of medications that we use, and you can then look forward by knowing how things have developed in the past, how we can look forward and see where the medication for Parkinson's disease, the future of medications for Parkinson's disease is headed. So it turns out that Parkinson's disease probably existed a lot longer than, the 19th century was when people believed it was first described in the literature. It was James Parkinson, the beginning of the 19th century, the 1800s, wrote a monograph describing 6 individuals that he had seen walking the streets of London with shuffling gait, decreased arm swing, tremor, and drooling. That's what he saw. He didn't even examine these people. They weren't his patients, but he wrote about them, and he called it the shaking palsy. And that was the name for Parkinson's disease because he's not going to put his name on this description. But more and more people began to say, yeah, we have those kind of patients, more and more. And by 1880, actually 1860 to 1880, the French neurologist Charcot was one of the fathers of modern neurology, who kind of established the way we think about patients' diseases. And one of the big breakthroughs that the French neurologist made was correlating this clinical history of the patient with post-mortem examination of the brain. It was in fact the French neurologists who first were able to associate the destruction of the left cerebral cortex being associated with paralysis on the right side of the body and loss of speech, more specifically the loss of speech or aphasia. And the only reason they could do that is because they had a person who developed an aphasia, means they didn't understand language, couldn't speak, was paralyzed in arm and leg on the right side. And they look at the brain, they see there's a big lesion from the stroke on the left side. So that was how the advances in modern neurology were made, by correlating clinical symptoms with pathology. So what were the medicines used up to Charcot's time? Well, during James Parkinson's time, he never treated any patients, and then all of the subsequent neurologists, they didn't know how to treat the shaking palsy. By the way, palsy is an English word meaning paralysis or weakness. Palsy doesn't mean what you think it does. A lot of people think palsy means, oh, I'm shaking, doc. I got the palsy. No, palsy just is an English word, Old English, no one uses it anymore except in Bell's palsy. Palsy means a paralysis, inability to move. The shaking paralysis is what James called it. But rather than call it the shaking paralysis, or the Latin term is paralysis agitans, the agitated paralysis, because it's not a true paralysis. There is no paralysis. There is no real lack of strength, but there is easy fatigability, difficulty initiating movement, etc. So that name, the shaking palsy, didn't sit well with Charcot, who, by the way, was the father of modern neurological approaches and also the one that trained Sigmund Freud, did some studies with Charcot. And Sigmund, of course, started off as a neuropathologist, and he ended up inventing psychoanalysis, making a lot of money along the way from psychoanalysis, dealing with neurosis and his concepts of why people have all kinds of mental conditions. In fact, this concept of neurosis was applied to Parkinson's disease around the time of Charcot. Many people, including Charcot, and put that notion of neurosis in Freud's mind, believed that Parkinson's disease was not a true organic brain disease, because when they looked at the brains of people with Parkinson's disease, Charcot and the 19th century, and they didn't see any specific lesion because they had crude instruments. They didn't see a lesion like you get with stroke. So they said, well, the brain looks normal in these people with the shaking palsy. By the way, let's call it Parkinson's disease, is what Charcot said in honor of James, because more and more patients are showing up with this disorder. And the increased prevalence of the illness correlated with the rise of the Industrial Revolution and the burning of coal and all kinds of toxic materials. And we know that Parkinson's disease does correlate with developed societies. The more advanced the Industrial Revolution was, the more Parkinson's disease that we got. But so they didn't find, they thought it was a neurosis. What is a neurosis? He thought what it meant was, why Charcot and Freud thought this was a neurosis is that at times people with Parkinson's disease were absolutely immobile. They just couldn't move no matter what. But if you just suddenly frightened them or yelled fire, they could get up out of the wheelchair and run out, just for a while. And he said, well, that's weird. Or maybe not such extreme situations where people at times can't move very well and they're shaking and they're rigid, and other times they seem to walk perfectly fine. So they said there must be a dissociation between the will to move, and the machinery of movement. It looks like the machinery movement's okay in Parkinson's disease, because look how well this person walked, and just 5 minutes ago he couldn't get out of his chair. So it must be some kind of block. It's kind of like a neurosis. Well, it turned out that it's not a neurosis, but emotions and feelings and stress will amplify the symptoms of Parkinsonism. So that whenever a person is stressed, they may move differently, they may have more tremor, etc. So I'm giving you all this as a background, historical background for the first drugs used to treat Parkinson's disease. So it was Charcot that influenced the later generation of English neurologists, including a guy named Gower, who wrote a classic book called Manual of Neurology, published in 1888. It's not too far ago, not too long ago. Seems a long time ago. I wasn't around, but our ancestors were. In any case, in the book was the first section where they talked about the treatment with medications of Parkinson's disease. Before then, they would do all kinds of weird things that looked like torture devices. For example, one of the ways to get rid of tremor, you can get rid of tremor by cutting nerves that control the arm, right? Well, they thought that's a bit too crude because then they're completely paralyzed. But they could do that. They said, what if we partially cut the nerves? Well, that didn't work. Then they developed these stretching of the brachial plexus machines, where they stretch and stretch gradually until you injure these, what's called a network of nerve fibers that exit from the spinal cord to innervate the arm and the hand. If you temporarily injure them by stretching and stretching, guess what? It gets rid of the tremor. But that, most people couldn't tolerate that. The treatment was like a medieval torture. It was called a physical therapy approach. Now, fortunately, we don't have to do that. The other approach that they had was to use these plant-derived materials, because most medications have been derived from plants, but before they could actually identify the active ingredient of the plants, they would prepare extracts or tinctures in alcohol of the plant material. So one of the ones that had been found to be useful was Belladonna, the plant Belladonna. And the Belladonna is related to the angel trumpets. It can be very toxic, the material, in the angel trumpet and in Belladonna alkaloids. But if you do an extract of Belladonna and you give it in small amounts, it was wonderful for the tremor. And it helped a bit with the rigidity, but it's mostly good for tremor. And so they used that until they identified the active principle of it. And the active principle of it was very similar. It was an anticholinergic drug. It was a molecule in there that blocked neurotransmission of acetylcholine, called anticholinergic. And so then they derived other similar compounds to this Belladonna alkaloid, and one of the first to be developed was called trihexyphenidyl in the 20th century, by the way, not in the 19th century. So trihexyphenidyl, many of you are familiar with it, is Arte. So that continues to be Originally started in the 19th century as an extract from Belladonna, and then now we have an active, pure drug called Artane. That's the brand name, trihexyphenidyl. There are a number of variants of that. And we use that with a lot of caution nowadays, because Artane, yes, is useful if you're less than 60, if you're not a man. Why do I mention that? Well, when you're over 60, you're more likely to have short-term memory problems from the use of Artane. And it blocks acetylcholine receptors that are important in the acquisition of new memories. So you may end up looking a bit like Alzheimer's, where you forgot things, and etc. In fact, Alzheimer's disease is due to a paucity, not enough acetylcholine making neurons in the subfrontal brain. So the Alzheimer's disease is due to underactivity of acetylcholine. So imagine something that worsens the acetylcholine deficiency. Now, as we get older, we all begin to have memory problems, but if you take Artane, you're really going to be very forgetful. And at somewhat higher doses, and if there's already some cognitive decline, that Artane can cause visual hallucinations that are quite frightening. In fact, that's why Belladonna alkaloids were abused, but are continued to be abused and used. So in the Amazon, they use Belladonna alkaloids as part of a ritual. Shamans use it for healing purposes, where they and the patient take the drug together and explore the spirit world and find out where the bad spirits are so they can get rid of them. So that's how they use Belladonna alkaloids in the Amazon, to produce hallucinations, to alter consciousness. And in fact, Artane will alter consciousness in patients with Parkinson's disease. And of course, no one wants that. It's very frightening. People act delirious, confused, and agitated. So you rarely see me prescribing Artane. Every now and then, I'll let anyone over 60 use it, because nothing else seems to help the tremor. But now that we have deep brain stimulation, which is very good for tremor, well, rather than adding Artane, I would suggest perhaps deep brain stimulation. So Artane, derived from Belladonna alkaloid, is one of the oldest drugs used in Parkinson's disease. We don't use it as much anymore. However, Artane and similar drugs, the anticholinergic class of drugs, have another effect that limits its use. That is, it inhibits a lot of the bladder activity. It inhibits the bladder. So ditropan, many people use to inhibit the bladder because they go so often to urinate. Well, Artane will inhibit the bladder and worsen constipation as well. So not only will it cause confusion, delirium, but make you constipated and develop urinary tract infection because you can't empty your bladder. So you can see why I'm cautious about Artane. So now you know about one drug that we don't use that much. However, that drug is used a lot in children. For some reason, children, they have such prodigious memories that you can give them pretty high doses of Artane and they have no problems tolerating it. So Artane is used to treat dystonia, and it's used in young onset torticollis, where the muscles involuntarily constrict in the neck and you have abnormal posture. Well, Artane alleviates that, especially when you can use significant doses. So the treatment of dystonia relies on Artane, but nowadays, if the dystonia is focal, involving just one set of muscles, Botox of the muscle works better. And how does Botox work? It inhibits the release of acetylcholine. That's why if you have all these wrinkles and frowns, the muscles are tight, you inhibit acetylcholine release with Botox, and it prevents frowning, prevents the muscle from contracting, so you get the smooth forehead that looks weird. Because every line is wisdom. So you have someone 80 years old that has a smooth forehead. Hey, they must be either imbeciles or over-Botoxed. Yeah, okay, so now you learned about one. Now the doses that we use of Artane usually is about 2 milligrams 3 times a day, but always start with a half of a tablet. And as I say, it's sometimes good if in tremor-predominant Parkinson's disease. It's a useful drug if you're less than 60. The reason is that once you get over 60, we already have problems with short-term memory. You don't want to worsen that. So what's the other drug that was old, that was used, and then wasn't used, and may be coming back? Then I'll get into all of the stuff you're familiar with. So one of the drugs that Gower, who wrote about belladonna alkaloids in 1888, it's in his standard handbook with dosing and how to treat it and what the effects are. It's a really fantastic book, very, very well written. He described the use of tincture of cannabis indica. Cannabis indica is, in the pejorative term in this country is marijuana, or Mary Jane. This is a name that the Mexican workers in Southern California gave it, to talk about the plant that they would smoke or ingest in various ways. And that became very popular with musicians, jazz musicians, etc. And then in the 60s was resurrected. The beatniks were into it in the 50s. The hippies really got into it, and then they got more interested in hallucinogens rather than cannabis. But the story of cannabis is very complicated. I'll go back to its use as a medicine in the 19th century. There, no one thought of smoking cannabis. They had various formulations of cannabis. One of them was to mix it in a tincture of cannabis indica and mix it with wine, it was a vial of tincture of cannabis indica for menstrual cramps. Queen Victoria of England was a user of cannabis for her menstrual cramps. In Parkinson's book, in Gower's book, he described how to use tincture of cannabis indica, and one of the ways, how much of the cannabis to prepare, how long he didn't spend a lot of time on the preparation, but referred to how it was done. And then once you have a vial of the concentrate of the tincture, which is in alcohol, you take an eyedropper and you put in maybe 1 cc of the tincture in your tea and drink that maybe 3 or 4 times a day. And it was very good for tremor, slowness, and rigidity, and didn't alter consciousness if it was used judiciously. If you use high doses, you'll get high. You have a slight change, a feeling of well-being. But I've never had a problem with a feeling of well-being. But Puritanical society, which is the basis of the United States, it was the Pilgrims and the Puritans who wanted freedom of religion. Anything that made you feel good, they were suspicious of. And the idea was we're here to suffer, to earn our way into paradise. So, if it made you feel good, be careful, Satan's behind it. So, that's why I had this thing, but if you had feelings of well-being, they looked at it with suspicion. But you could avoid feelings of well-being if you took it at a certain dose regimen. Then that continued to be used all the way until 1937 around the world, where cannabis in various preparations was in the pharmacopoeia, the listing of every drug used in medicine. And cannabis was there until 1937, when it was removed, because of a number of things that happened that is political and economic about the use of cannabis. Basically, cannabis became into the radar of the Anslinger and the enforcers of alcohol prohibition. You remember there was this great experiment in the US. You'd think we were a Muslim country and that no alcohol allowed, just like Muslim countries. What in those Muslim countries, you can always drink alcohol, you just can't do it publicly. There's no bars publicly. So everything went underground with alcohol. And to enforce the laws, there was a police agency headed by Harry Anslinger, and they went after bootleggers, smugglers, people who made the gin in their bathtub, people who smuggled it in, and many, many well-known families made their fortune that way. The Kennedys in Boston made a lot of money running rum from the Bahamas, and also into Florida. Many old Floridians made money that way, just like in the later generations they made it through smuggling cannabis, smuggling cocaine. But alcohol was at that level, and then finally, it was so ridiculous that the crimes were worse than ever. Numbers of killings, the appearance into the public of tainted alcohol that caused blindness. The prohibition of alcohol was worse than the alcohol. Now, alcohol abuse was a really big deal, and it continues to be a big deal. I mean, most automobile accidents are caused while driving under the influence of alcohol. So But the prohibition was repealed because it was too expensive, and it's not just in terms of the cost of enforcement. Think of it, you can't tax alcohol, right? And it's a big source of revenue. The people making the money were the underground, just like the cannabis people were making all the money, right? So prohibition was repealed, and Anslinger had to, it was the beginning of the Depression, 1932. So he had to keep all of his huge police force, federal police force, which later became the Drug Enforcement Agency after 1970. They had to go after something else. So an easy target was the cannabis, the marijuana users. You know, it was very easy to go after the people who had no defenses, so the Mexican laborers, the jazz musicians from New Orleans, but anybody who was in the minority who used marijuana, they were targeted, and it became, basically eventually was made illegal and put in Schedule 1 along with heroin, LSD, psilocybin, all of these other drugs, because they say cannabis had no medical use and it was dangerous. It was a gateway drug to heavy drugs. And that was maintained mostly for social political reasons. And it's still that way until finally, at the federal level, it's still Schedule 1 drug. The DEA has the option to raid any of these dispensaries because by the federal law, it's illegal. No physician, even if he's allowed by his state to recommend cannabis, cannot really prescribe it like you would prescribe an opiate drug on a prescription pad without much regulation, other than you need a DEA number. Well, for cannabis, you have to, you can't prescribe it, but you can make a recommendation in a state where it's legal, and with that recommendation, provided the patient is registered in that state where it's legal, they can go to a dispensary and obtain cannabis. So that's gonna happen in Florida. So cannabis in various formulations will be available for Parkinson's disease. Now, we already have 2 of the active agents that have been identified, but all of the pure individual active agents, the first one is THC. It's what makes people, quote, high. And there are a number of forms of it that have been approved by the FDA already for treating of glaucoma or nausea and vomiting. There is semi-synthetic THC, and that's available since '85. That's why they say, well, we're going to keep cannabis Schedule 1, but here any physician can write a prescription for THC-like drugs for glaucoma or nausea, vomiting due to chemotherapy. Unfortunately, when you give THC, it's hard to adjust the dosage, and it takes hours for it to kick in. So it's not a very useful drug. And if you give the other major ingredient, cannabidiol, which is an interesting compound, has antioxidative effects, neuroprotectant effects, and I should mention, even though the FDA classifies cannabis as illegal, Schedule 1, the NIH, another branch of the government, has a patent on several cannabis extracts, cannabis-derived drugs, to treat, to be neuroprotective, to treat stroke, to treat traumatic brain injury, etc. So there's a lot of stuff that's changing right now. So I think the drug of the future will be some kind of cannabinoid agent. And the reason that cannabis from the plant works is that our brain is loaded with endogenous cannabinoid receptors. We make our own cannabis in all the parts of the brain. The highest levels of our own cannabis are in the deep gray structures of the brain involved in the control of movement. And so there is a problem with the Parkinson's disease production of the cannabis receptor. So there's a kind of a deficiency, cannabinoid deficiency. So if you ingest a cannabis preparation, it might improve your motor function and give you a feeling of well-being. So it depends on, this is the stuff that has to be worked out. It turns out that there is an entourage effect of the cannabinoids. That's why extracts of the whole plant are much more effective than pure THC or pure CBD. And so the cannabis of the future will be like is available in Canada. It's funny, Canada cannabis, I just occurred to me. So anyway, in Canada, GW Pharmaceuticals has on the market a preparation of cannabis that has THC and CBD in a mix of many other endogenous, phytocannabinoids. There are other similar structures in the plant. And it's an oral mucosal spray, and you can adjust the ratio of THC to CBD depending on what the indication is. And there's where a lot of research has to take place to find the right combination of THC to CBD and the right delivery system. So you can take sprays, it's like a breath mint, it's absorbed through the mucous membrane, you're not supposed to inhale it. We don't recommend smoking these things because then you get too many other bad things. So in the next 5 years, you're going to see a lot more research and recommendations for cannabis for Parkinson's disease. I've written 2 chapters on the review of cannabis for movement disorders and one for just for neurology in general. What I find fascinating about it is that cannabis has been used for thousands of years, and in the Ayurvedic literature, old Hindu medicine literature, they talk about using this for nervous conditions. It's been around. Cannabis has been around to help the nervous system for quite a long time. So it's one of the more ancient sources of drugs for nervous conditions, for neurological conditions. So let's get into the 20th century. What I've talked about were the 2 most important 19th century medications, one of which is still used, but sparingly in Parkinson's. The other will probably be used more as we go forward. And as I mentioned about the combination of THC and CBD and extracts working better than any one individual pure chemical, that goes against the grain of the classical pharmacologists. And I'm one of those. I studied pharmacology, I have a PhD. And we were trained to think pure drug, one receptor. And if you have several drugs, it's going to be hard to understand how they work. Well, my view is, and there's literature to show this, that if you use just pure THC or pure CBD to treat seizures, it doesn't work very well. But if you use the combination, there is an entourage effect that the things beyond the THC, like CBD and some of the similar compounds, seem to be more effective and less deleterious. And the same thing was just recently shown about anti-malarial drugs. There's a pure drug called artemisinin, derived from a shrub called Artemisia species, but the pure drug kills malaria parasites within cells. Very effective. But within 6 months, as malarial parasites develop resistance to that drug, malaria comes back. But if you do an experiment where you give people extracts of the whole plant that has artemisinin and a whole bunch of related molecules, slight variants of it, it kills the malaria just as well as the pure drug, but they don't develop resistance. So it's an example of an entourage effect. And so more and more pharmacologists are starting to look at entourage effects with other medications. I mean, ideally it would be great. One drug, one disease, one receptor, but we use polypharmacy, and now this entourage effects is going to be more and more important as we go forward in this field. We already use multiple drugs in Parkinson's disease. We start with one, then we have another, then we have a third and a fourth. It becomes very, very difficult, as you know, to juggle all these medications. It's because we're just addressing symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And so as symptoms evolve, we add something else, and then that something else causes another symptom due to the drug, so you do something else. So very, very tricky. It's good to have some understanding of how the drugs work. And so your neurologist should be fairly well versed in pharmacology. And if they weren't initially, they would be if all they do is work heavily with Parkinson's disease, because you have to become an expert. You have to read about these drugs. So now we'll get into the contemporary things that began around 1913. Was the first time someone noticed an unusual finding in the brains of people with Parkinson's disease. Up till then, they said the brains are normal. This must be a neurosis, because we can't put our finger on the pathology. There is no known pathology. We didn't have the tools for measuring chemistry in the brain, of the sophisticated tools to measure neurotransmitters, the chemicals that mediate communication from one brain cell to another. Like acetylcholine is the classical neurotransmitter. It's involved in neuron to neuron transmission. It's involved from nerve to muscle transmission. It's involved from nerve to gut. So acetylcholine is a very critical one. And we knew about acetylcholine from bioassays. I'm not going to get into what, but we didn't know how to measure it properly using chemical techniques. A bioassay would be as follows. If you have a Belladonna alkaloid, and you get an extract out of it, and you want to see how it works, you can get what's called a nerve muscle preparation. So you get a frog thigh that is freshly killed, dissected, decapitated, or sometimes not. They're just anesthetized. And you put an electrode to the femoral nerve that's going to constrict the muscle. And you have a gauge that measures the muscle constriction. So if you stimulate the nerve in a bath, but it has to be in a saline bath, otherwise it won't work. The muscle constricts, and you can measure every time you stimulate the nerve, the muscle constricts. If you then collect the fluid and add that fluid to another bath that hasn't been stimulated electrically, and then the muscle constricts just from the something is released by stimulation. That was the first sign. This is a classic experiment done in the 19th century that's called a bioassay. They identified a substance released by stimulating a nerve of a frog that had the same effect as the electrical stimulation. So that was the beginning of the concept of neurotransmitters. If you added belladonna alkaloids to the bath and stimulated, you wouldn't get the contraction. Why? Because belladonna alkaloid blocked the actions on the muscle of acetylcholine. So this is how pharmacology evolves. So 1913, now we didn't know how to measure acetylcholine chemically. We could just see what the biological effects of it were. That's how most of the neurotransmitters, adrenaline, which was, well, it's a similar story. Eventually the chemical is identified and tested in these biological systems. But in 1913, a guy named Hassler saw something in the brain. He saw that there were these inclusion bodies in the brainstem. And they were called Lewy bodies. It was, and no one knew what it meant, but at least there was some pathology there. They couldn't understand how a Lewy body could cause Parkinson's disease, but it was something noted. And then later on, not soon thereafter, people began to notice that the substantia nigra was pale in people's brains, paler than it should be, because of the loss of cells, neurons that contain neuromelanin, and those are the neurons that make dopamine. And then the big breakthrough was in 1950, when drugs were being studied to treat schizophrenia and paranoia that produce as a side effect, the drug is called thorazine or phenothiazines. They're like powerful antihistamines that were being developed as pre-anesthetic agents, but then they found they're great antipsychotic drugs. So they were given in trials to patients with schizophrenia, and it was very dramatically effective against paranoia, aggressive behavior. But many of these young schizophrenic patients treated with thorazine developed Parkinsonism, shuffling gait, salivation, tremors, rigidity. And if you took that thorazine away, they became normal again, motorically, but then redeveloped their schizophrenia. So in the study of how these drugs worked, a guy named Carlson got the Nobel Prize for this, began to look at animal models of thorazine-induced Parkinsonism. So you can give a rat thorazine and it become like a log. You can pick up that rat by putting one finger under the tail, one finger under the nose, pick him up, and he's stiff. Set him down, right? That's how powerful the drug is. And he began to analyze the brain tissues, and at the time he was doing this, the reason he made progress is there was a whole new way to measure brain neurotransmitters using HPLC, electrochemical detection, new technology. And he applied this new technology to measure a number of neurotransmitters. The one that the assay was available for was dopamine, noradrenaline, and noradrenaline. He found that there was a problem with dopamine, that this drug blocked dopamine action, and if you depleted dopamine with another tranquilizer called reserpine, you develop the same thing. So he realized it's a dopamine problem. And so then he asked for some brain tissue from the brain banks in Austria, from individuals who had in-life Parkinson's disease, and he analyzed the substantia nigra, the striatum, the other parts of the brain, and found that people with Parkinson's disease weren't making any dopamine. and not enough norepinephrine, not enough serotonin, but dopamine seemed to be the most depleted in these brains. So he suggested to someone, because we knew a lot, once you began to measure these chemicals, we began to wonder, how are they made in the body? So we already knew the biosynthetic pathway for dopamine. We knew that levodopa, which is a naturally occurring amino acid of protein, and proteins are made up of chains of amino acids, and levodopa is one of them. And if the brain makes dopamine from the levodopa that's circulating from the breakdown of the protein that you eat in a meal. So when you give large amounts of levodopa, it can cross the blood-brain barrier and made into dopamine, and then patients got better. So they did a clinical study. First, they showed it worked in rats and animals, and they did the first clinical trials in the early 60s with levodopa. Now, initially, people couldn't deal with levodopa. It made them nauseous. You had to take 8 grams a day. Grams, think of it. You take 100 milligrams in a 25-100 tablet. And so the only people who got better on levodopa were people who had an iron stomach. They could take it, gradually build it up, and not throw it up. And those are the people that got out of the wheelchairs and started chasing the nurses. And they got a reputation of an aphrodisiac because they were so excited that they can move now, And so, but what about all the other people who couldn't take levodopa? So they began to look at why levodopa caused nausea and vomiting. Well, levodopa, immediately when it gets into the gut and in the blood, is metabolized into dopamine. And dopamine cannot cross the blood-brain barrier, but it does react at the blood-brain barrier junction to the vomiting zone, called the chemoreceptive trigger zone, which has dopamine receptors. So dopamine tickles the vomiting center and makes you throw up. So if you could prevent the blood and liver and gut metabolism of levodopa, you'd have enough levodopa free to get into the brain, right? Because dopamine can't get into the brain, and then it causes vomiting, and then it's metabolized and eliminated. So all that levodopa you took, you don't really get enough dopamine unless you take grams of it. Now, by adding carbidopa, which looks a lot like levodopa, it fools the decarboxylase system, thinking it's levodopa, and occupies those enzymes so that the levodopa is unmetabolized, and therefore you can get by with just a set of grams with milligram amounts of levodopa. And since it's not being made into dopamine in the blood and liver, it doesn't cause as much nausea and vomiting. And that was given the name levodopa without vomit, which many of you know in Latin is sin emesis. Sin emesis means without vomit. Anti-emetic means anti-vomiting. Emesis is vomiting. Levodopa without vomiting is called Cinemet. So that's how, now you know how the name came to be. It made a lot of money for the company. Because everyone could get levodopa, there's no patent for that. It's a naturally occurring amino acid. And there are people in India who make extracts from a legume called Mucuna pruriens that is heavily loaded with levodopa. And it's a cheap way to get levodopa. It's just an extra, and you can get it in India because they can't really afford carbidopa, levodopa. It's very expensive. The problem is you have to take tons of this legume, and most people would not like it. Periodically I get a question, could I take enough beans to alleviate my Parkinson's disease? Well, no, you can't. So now we have levodopa, carbidopa. Big breakthrough. That was a big revolution because what it did that was very dramatic was alleviate slowness of movement, the ability to initiate movement, rigidity, and tremor to some extent. In some people the tremor doesn't quite disappear. In that case you might add a little bit of artane. But in general, the tremor of Parkinson's disease is that part of the illness that least interferes with function because it's a rest tremor. If I have the rest tremor and I reach, it stops. And I'm slow maybe, but I won't have this kind of tremor, which is the action tremors, which is not part of the Parkinson tremor. And people who have tremor-predominant Parkinson's disease have a slower rate of progression. They do better than the rigid akinetic form. They never have tremor. But the ones that are rigid akinetic are the ones that end up in nursing homes quicker. So even though 30% of people with Parkinson's disease never have tremor, it's in a way good to have tremor as a predictor of slow progression. So levodopa, carbidopa became very important, but within 3 to 5 years of using levodopa, carbidopa, we began to find its limitations. Look at every new drug, we will find problems eventually. Because drugs don't have just one action, they have a constellation of actions. So what happened with levodopa, carbidopa, many of you already know. Number one, it doesn't last forever. That initially you can get by with 3 tablets a day because that dopamine that you're making from the cinnamon is stored in the remaining dopamine neuron fibers that you have. Because when you develop the illness, you still have plenty of dopamine fibers. You've lost the majority of it, but you still can store dopamine. So that the levodopa that you've taken by mouth is gone from the blood in 3 hours. But your clinical benefit can last 8 hours. Right? But with time, as the illness progresses, you have less capacity to store dopamine from the levodopa, and so that the duration of benefit from each tablet of cinnamon gets shorter and shorter as the illness progresses. So therefore, and that's called the pharmacokinetic basis for wearing off. People develop, quote, wearing off, and they have to take the medicine more close together. Instead of once, twice a day, once, 3 times a day, some people take it 1 tablet every 3 hours. To correspond to the half-life in the blood of levodopa. But the more you increase the dose at each dose. So initially you start with 1, 25, 100, and some eventually get to 25, 250. 250 is 250 milligrams of levodopa. Eventually, when you take high enough doses frequently of levodopa, 50% of patients within 3 years of taking that regimen will develop what are called dyskinesias and motor fluctuations. The dyskinesias are very complex. They can occur an hour after you take the levodopa or the cinnamon, and they're dance-like movements, twisting, turning movements like this. That is not part of the illness. It's part of the reaction to the levodopa acting on a degenerating system. Levodopa will not cause dyskinesias in an intact brain, but in a brain that's lost dopamine receptors gradually, lost dopamine innervation of the receptors, they will develop these motor complications. And not only do they have wearing off, but they'll have dyskinesias that occur an hour after. Sometimes the dyskinesia will last the whole day, and sometimes it only lasts for a half hour, and then dyskinesia goes away, and then they're on for about 2 hours, and then they're off, and then the whole cycle repeats. And some people have end-of-dose dyskinesia, where just before the next dose, as the drug is almost all gone from the blood, do they have the dyskinesias. Some people have biphasic dyskinesias, at the beginning of the drug action, at the end of drug action. And some people have action-induced dyskinesias. So you see, once the dyskinesias develop, we have a lot of problems. And we know that dyskinesias are due to the use of levodopa, the pulsatile administration, because it's quick and onset, quick and offset. So they said, well, what if we gave a slow onset and slow offset cinnamon? Will we not get dyskinesias? Get the dyskinesias just as much. So it's not that it's quick onset and quick offset. It's still not clear why the dyskinesias develop, other than this hypothesis, that the denervated striatum, you're losing, denervation means you're losing the neuronal input of dopamine to the target, which is the striatum, results in increased sensitivity of dopamine receptors, an increased number of them. So that then dopamine stimulation of these increasingly sensitive dopamine receptors result in overreaction and abnormal movement. So this is what happens. Initially, you don't have any dopamine. The dopamine replacement works beautifully, but then you become very sensitive, hypersensitive to dopamine. So what I end up doing for people with complex motor fluctuations, there are 2 things to do. Yeah, I can still use my hands, good. One is send them to the neurosurgeon, because complex motor fluctuations, especially if you had a very good response to levodopa, can be beautifully treated with a pacemaker to the subthalamic nucleus. However, there's too many complications, in my view, with deep brain stimulation. And secondly, it really doesn't help gait and balance. It'll help the motor fluctuations, but it won't. They'll still have problems initiating gait, and they can develop some kind of cognitive worsening. So that's why before any deep brain stimulation is done, one has to have a cognitive assessment. If you have any mild dementia, it's okay, but moderate or more advanced dementia, there's no way you can have deep brain stimulation. So what the approach that we use to avoid deep brain stimulation is to use a 24-hour-a-day lasting dopamine stimulation. Because the idea is if you have constant stimulation of dopamine receptors, you won't have all this kick on, kick off, kick on, kick off, aggravate those dopamine receptors, make them even more sensitive. By having constant stimulation of receptors, you downregulate, you decrease the sensitivity a bit, decrease the overreaction. So the transition from all this levodopa to a long-acting dopamine agonist, what is an agonist? It's a synthetic dopamine that acts on dopamine receptors. It acts like levodopa. It acts like dopamine, really. Levodopa becomes dopamine and then stimulates dopamine receptors and allows you to move, right? A dopamine agonist doesn't have to be converted. It gets into the brain, acts on dopamine receptors, and if it's a long-acting one, that lasts 24 hours a day. There's only one that does that, by the way. Nupro, the patch.